The wind howled through the frozen streets of Quebec City like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of death for those foolish enough to venture into the December night of 1775. Colonel Benedict Arnold pressed his frostbitten fingers against the stone wall of a ramshackle warehouse, peering through the swirling snow at the fortress that had become both his obsession and his nightmare. The ancient city perched on its rocky promontory above the St. Lawrence River, its walls bristling with British cannons and defended by seasoned troops who had no intention of surrendering to a ragtag band of American rebels. Arnold's breath formed ghostly clouds in the bitter air as he contemplated the impossible task before him. For months, he and his men had endured a hellish march through the Maine wilderness, following rivers and portages that seemed designed by the devil himself to break the spirits of mortal men. They had eaten their leather shoes, boiled tree bark for sustenance, and watched their comrades die from exposure and disease. Yet somehow, through sheer force of will and an unshakable belief in their cause, they had reached this moment. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. General Richard Montgomery, fresh from his bloodless capture of Montreal in November, would lead his force of New York troops in a diversionary attack from the south, while Arnold's New England veterans would assault the lower town from the north. The twin-pronged attack would converge in the narrow streets below the citadel, where they would join forces and storm the seemingly impregnable walls of the upper town. It was a strategy born of desperation and fueled by the revolutionary fervor that had already set the 13 colonies ablaze with rebellion. As referenced in accounts from the American Battlefield Trust, the coastal areas along the St. Lawrence River presented fewer British defenses, giving Montgomery hope that his southern approach might succeed where conventional assault had failed countless times before. The weather had become both ally and enemy. The howling blizzard that swept across Quebec on this New Year's Eve would provide perfect cover for their movements, concealing their approach from British sentries and muffling the sounds of their advance. Yet that same storm threatened to freeze the blood in their veins and turn their muskets into useless clubs of ice and metal. Arnold watched his men huddling in whatever shelter they could find, their faces gaunt with hunger and painted with the peculiar pallor that comes from too many nights spent sleeping on frozen ground. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would bring the vast territory of Quebec into the American rebellion, potentially drawing France into the conflict and opening a second front that could prove decisive in the struggle for independence. The French-speaking inhabitants of Quebec had shown little enthusiasm for British rule, and many American leaders believed they would rally to the revolutionary cause if given proper encouragement. Failure, however, would mean the death or capture of two of the Continental Army's most capable commanders and the effective end of American ambitions in the Northern Territories. Arnold's mind wandered to the intelligence reports that had filtered through the lines over the past weeks. Governor Guy Carleton commanded the British forces in Quebec, and by all accounts, he was a competent and determined officer who had used the respite since Montreal's fall to strengthen his defenses and rally his men. The fortress walls, built by French engineers decades earlier and improved by British military architects, presented a formidable obstacle even under ideal conditions. In the middle of a blizzard, with exhausted troops and limited ammunition, the task seemed almost impossible. Yet impossibility had never deterred Benedict Arnold. The same fierce ambition that would later drive him to treachery now burned with patriotic fire, and he had no intention of allowing his men to suffer and die without achieving something worthy of their sacrifice. As the storm intensified and the clock moved closer to midnight, he made his final preparations, knowing that within hours, the frozen streets of Quebec would run red with blood, and the fate of the American Revolution might well hang in the balance. General Richard Montgomery stood at the edge of his camp, the wind whipping his cloak around his tall frame as he watched the last preparations for the assault. The Irish-born former British officer had already proven his worth to the American cause with his masterful capture of Montreal, but Quebec represented a challenge of an entirely different magnitude. Unlike Montreal, which had fallen without a shot being fired, Quebec bristled with defenses and housed a garrison determined to fight to the last man. The general's weathered face, marked by years of military service in the Caribbean and North America, showed no trace of the doubt that gnawed at his conscience. His men were volunteers, farmers and merchants who had left their families and livelihoods to follow him into this frozen hell, and he felt the weight of their trust like a physical burden. Many had enlisted for terms that would expire with the new year, and Montgomery knew that waiting for spring would mean the dissolution of his army. Through desertion and expiration of enlistments, the attack had to come now, in the teeth of the storm, or not at all. The plan they had developed was intricate and dangerous, requiring precise timing and more than a little luck. Montgomery would lead approximately 300 men in a flanking movement around the southern edge of the city, following the narrow strip of land between the fortress walls and icy waters of the St. Lawrence. Their objective was a two-story blockhouse that guarded the approach to the lower town, a structure that intelligence suggested was lightly defended and could be taken by surprise. Once the blockhouse fell, they would push into the lower town itself and establish a foothold for the main assault. Meanwhile, Arnold would lead his force of 600 men in a similar flanking movement from the north, targeting another blockhouse that controlled access to the lower town from that direction. The two forces would then converge in the narrow streets and alleyways of the commercial district, where they would regroup and prepare for the final assault on the upper town. Diversionary attacks by smaller forces would attempt to draw British attention away from the main thrusts, creating confusion and hopefully preventing Carleton from concentrating his defenders. At the critical points, the weather had deteriorated throughout the day, transforming from light snow into a howling blizzard that reduced visibility to mere yards and turned every step into a struggle against the elements. Montgomery's experience recognized both the opportunity and the danger in such conditions. The storm would indeed conceal their movements and muffle the sounds of their approach, but it would also make coordination between the attacking columns nearly impossible, and increase the risk of men becoming separated from their units in the darkness and confusion. As midnight approached on December 31st, 1775, Montgomery gathered his officers for final instructions. Captain Jacob Cheeseman, Lieutenant John McPherson, and the other company commanders listened intently as their general outlined the assault plan one final time. Each man understood that they were about to embark on one of the most daring military ventures in the short history of the Continental Army, an attack that would either crown their Canadian campaign with glory or end it in disaster and death. The general's aide-de-camp handed him a dispatch that had arrived just hours earlier from General Benedict Arnold, confirming that his force was in position and ready to launch their simultaneous assault. Arnold's column had endured perhaps even greater hardships than Montgomery's men, having survived their epic march through the Maine wilderness, only to spend weeks in makeshift camps outside Quebec's walls. Yet Arnold's message radiated confidence and determination, assuring Montgomery that his New Englanders would play their part in the night's drama, regardless of the cost. Montgomery checked his pocket watch one final time, noting that the hands stood at 11:30. In 30 minutes, they would begin their approach to the city walls. Moving through the storm like ghosts seeking vengeance, the general drew his sword, its steel gleaming dully in the lamplight, and addressed his men with the words that would either inspire them to victory or serve as his epitaph. The revolution had reached its moment of truth in the frozen streets of Quebec, and there could be no turning back from the path they had chosen. The attack began at the stroke of midnight, as 1775 gave way to 1776, with all the symbolic weight that such a transition could bear. Through the howling wind and driving snow, the columns of American soldiers moved like wraiths toward their destiny, their footsteps muffled by the carpet of white that covered the frozen ground. Each man carried with him not just his musket and bayonet, but the hopes and fears of a continent in rebellion. Benedict Arnold's northern column advanced through terrain that seemed designed by nature to thwart military operations. The approach to their target, a blockhouse known as the Salto-Metellet Battery, required them to navigate a maze of warehouses, wood piles, and debris that lined the lower town's northern edge. The storm had transformed familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes that loomed out of the darkness without warning, causing men to stumble and fall on the treacherous footing beneath their feet. Arnold himself moved at the head of his column, his wounded leg from the previous year's Ticonderoga campaign aching with each step, but his resolve unshaken. Behind him came men whose names would echo through American history: Captain Daniel Morgan with his Virginia riflemen, Major Returned Jonathan Meigs with his Connecticut troops, and Captain Simeon Thayer leading his Rhode Island company. These were veterans of earlier campaigns, men who had proven themselves in battle and earned the right to stand beside their commander in this most desperate of ventures. The first sign of trouble came not from enemy fire, but from the elements themselves. The blizzard had intensified beyond anything the planners had anticipated, reducing visibility to mere feet and creating drifts that in some places reached nearly to a man's waist. Several soldiers in Arnold's column became separated from their units in the swirling white chaos, their shouts for help swallowed by the wind before they could reach friendly ears. The storm that was supposed to conceal their approach was threatening to scatter their force before they could even engage the enemy. Meanwhile, General Montgomery's southern column faced its own challenges as they attempted to navigate the narrow strip of ground between the city walls and the river. The path they had chosen was treacherous under the best of conditions, with loose rocks and icy patches that could send a man tumbling into the frigid waters below. The storm made their footing even more precarious, and Montgomery found himself repeatedly calling soft-voiced warnings to his men as they picked their way along the dangerous route. The British defenders, huddled behind their fortifications and struggling to maintain their vigilance in the face of the howling storm, were initially unaware of the approaching danger. Sentries posted at the key defensive positions found their vision limited to a few yards and their hearing reduced to the constant roar of wind and snow. The Americans had indeed achieved the element of surprise that Montgomery had hoped for, but whether they could maintain it long enough to reach their objectives remained to be seen. As detailed in historical accounts from Mount Vernon's digital archives, the assault would end with Arnold wounded and Montgomery dead, with 400 American men captured. Though Arnold would continue the siege for several months after the initial defeat, Arnold's column reached the outskirts of the Saltomatella battery just as the church bells of Quebec began tolling the new year. The colonel raised his hand to signal a halt, then crept forward with several of his officers to reconnoiter the position. Through the swirling snow, they could make out the dark bulk of the blockhouse and the shadowy figures of British sentries, who seemed to be struggling against the storm rather than watching for attackers. This was the moment they had planned for, the instant when months of preparation and suffering would either pay dividends or prove to have been in vain. The signal to attack would come within minutes, and when it did, the frozen air would erupt in musket fire and the clash of bayonets. The American Revolution was about to face one of its most severe tests, and the outcome would depend as much on the fury of nature as on the courage of men. The first musket shots cracked through the storm-laden air at 10 minutes past midnight, shattering the eerie quiet that had settled over Quebec's lower town. Benedict Arnold's men had been spotted by a British sentry as they approached the Saltomatella battery, and what had been planned as a surprise assault immediately devolved into a desperate firefight in the narrow confines of the commercial district's winding streets. Arnold himself led the charge with characteristic boldness, his sword raised above his head as he urged his men forward through the deepening snow. The colonel's voice, hoarse from shouting commands over the howling wind, carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had never asked his soldiers to go anywhere. He would not lead them. Behind him, Captain Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen moved with the practiced efficiency of frontiersmen, their long rifles seeking targets among the British defenders who had rushed to man the barricades. The British response was swift and devastating. Captain Chabot, commanding the Saltomatella position, had anticipated exactly this type of attack and had positioned his men to create interlocking fields of fire that would trap any assault force in a deadly crossfire from loopholes cut in the walls of the blockhouse and from carefully prepared positions behind overturned carts and barrels. British muskets began their deadly work, sending lead balls whizzing through the storm to find American flesh and bone. Within minutes of the fighting's commencement, disaster struck the American assault. Benedict Arnold, pressing forward at the head of his men in an attempt to reach the British barricades, suddenly stumbled and fell, blood streaming from a wound in his lower leg. The same limb that had been injured at Ticonderoga had been struck again, this time by a musket ball that shattered bone and tore through muscle with agonizing effect. As his men rushed to pull their wounded commander to safety, Arnold continued to shout encouragement and orders, refusing to be evacuated until he was convinced that Captain Morgan could maintain the attack without him. The loss of Arnold's leadership at such a critical moment sent ripples of confusion through the American ranks. Captain Morgan, a veteran of frontier warfare but new to commanding large units in conventional battle, found himself suddenly responsible for an assault that was already beginning to falter under the weight of effective British defensive fire. The storm that had been their ally in approaching the city now became their enemy, making it nearly impossible to coordinate movements or even determine the locations of friendly units. In the swirling chaos on the southern approach, General Montgomery's column had encountered their own deadly reception. The Irish-born general had successfully led his men around the edge of the fortress walls and was approaching his designated target when British defenders opened fire from concealed positions. Unlike Arnold's more gradual wounding, Montgomery's fate was immediate and final. A blast of canister shot from a British cannon caught the general squarely in the chest, killing him instantly and sending his body tumbling into a snowdrift that quickly turned crimson with his blood. The death of Montgomery sent shockwaves through his column that were felt immediately and catastrophically. Captain Jacob Cheeseman, the senior surviving officer, found himself commanding men who had followed Montgomery out of personal loyalty and who were now faced with the prospect of continuing an assault that had just lost its primary architect. Within minutes, what had been a coordinated attack began to dissolve into a series of unconnected skirmishes, as American units lost communication with each other in the storm and confusion of battle. Captain Daniel Morgan, meanwhile, was discovering that frontier fighting and urban warfare required entirely different skills. The narrow streets and alleyways of the lower town created a maze that favored defenders who knew the terrain over attackers who were seeing it for the first time. British defenders could fire from windows and doorways, then disappear into buildings and emerge elsewhere, while the Americans found themselves channeled into killing zones where their numerical advantage meant nothing. The storm continued to rage with undiminished fury, turning the battlefield into a nightmare landscape, where men fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness, and bayonet charges ended with soldiers stabbing at shadows, snow mixed with gunpowder smoke, to create an atmosphere that reduced visibility to mere feet, while the constant wind made it impossible to hear shouted orders or coordinate movements between units. What had begun as a carefully planned assault was rapidly becoming a chaotic melee, where survival depended more on luck than skill or courage. As the minutes stretched into hours, it became increasingly clear that the American attack was failing. Without Arnold's leadership in the north and Montgomery's in the south, the assault had lost both its coordination and its momentum, leaving individual units to fight desperate holding actions against defenders who held every advantage that terrain and preparation could provide. As dawn approached through the continuing blizzard, the full scope of the American disaster began to reveal itself in the gray half-light that filtered through the storm clouds. Captain Daniel Morgan, now effectively commanding the northern assault after Arnold's wounding, found his men trapped in a deadly cul-de-sac formed by the converging streets of the lower town. What had appeared in their intelligence reports as a clear route to the upper town had proven to be a carefully prepared killing ground, where British defenders could bring devastating fire to bear from multiple directions. Governor Guy Carleton, commanding the British defense from his headquarters in the shadow of St. Louis, had anticipated exactly this type of winter assault and had spent weeks preparing his response. The veteran officer, who had served with distinction in European campaigns before taking command in Quebec, understood that the Americans would be forced to attack through the lower town's narrow streets, and he had positioned his defenders accordingly. Lieutenant Anderson commanded the northern blockhouse, while Captain Laws held the southern approach, with both officers operating under strict orders to funnel any attack into predetermined zones, where concentrated fire could achieve maximum effect. The British strategy was working with devastating efficiency. Morgan's Virginia riflemen, accustomed to fighting in the open forests of the frontier, found themselves constrained by buildings and walls that negated their advantages in marksmanship and mobility. The long rifles that had proven so effective against British regulars in previous engagements became unwieldy in the close confines of urban combat, while British muskets, with their faster loading times and bayonets, proved better suited to the brutal reality of street fighting. More catastrophically, the Americans discovered that they had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Carleton had deliberately left certain approaches lightly defended, encouraging the attackers to penetrate deeply into the lower town before springing his snare. Now, with British reinforcements moving to seal off the streets behind them, Morgan's men found themselves surrounded and facing the prospect of either surrender or annihilation. The situation was complicated by the continuing storm, which made any attempt at organized withdrawal nearly impossible. Men who became separated from their units in the swirling snow often wandered for hours before stumbling into enemy positions or, worse, becoming lost in the maze of streets and freezing to death in doorways and alleys. The same weather that had concealed their approach now prevented any coordinated retreat, leaving small groups of Americans scattered throughout the lower town like islands in a hostile sea. Captain Laws, commanding the southern defensive position, reported to Carleton that the American attack from that direction had completely collapsed following Montgomery's death. The general's body had been recovered by British troops and treated with the respect due a worthy adversary, but his men had scattered into the storm, many surrendering when they encountered British patrols rather than face the prospect of freezing to death in the wilderness. The southern prong of the American assault had effectively ceased to exist as an organized military force. In the northern sector, however, Captain Morgan continued to fight with the stubborn determination that had made him legendary among American forces. The former Teamster turned soldier understood that surrender meant imprisonment, or worse for his men, and he was prepared to sell their lives dearly rather than give up without a fight. Using buildings and barricades for cover, his riflemen continued to engage British positions, hoping against hope that some opportunity for escape might present itself. The psychological impact of the failed assault extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Word of Montgomery's death and Arnold's wounding spread quickly through the American camps outside the city, demoralizing men who had already endured months of hardship and privation. The promise of French-Canadian support, which had been one of the primary justifications for the Quebec expedition, had proven largely illusory, with most inhabitants choosing to remain neutral rather than risk British retaliation. As the morning progressed and the storm began to show signs of abating, Carleton prepared to tighten the noose around the remaining American forces. Fresh troops moved through the upper town's covered passages, preparing to descend into the lower town and complete the destruction of the assault force. The governor's strategy had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations, and he now faced the pleasant task of deciding how generous to be in accepting the surrender of enemies who had dared to attack the strongest fortress in North America. The American Revolution's northern campaign was about to end in complete and utter defeat, with consequences that would echo throughout the war and beyond. The white flag that appeared above the American positions in the lower town just after 8 o'clock in the morning of January 1st, 1776, marked the effective end of one of the most ambitious military operations in the early history of the Continental Army. Captain Daniel Morgan, his face streaked with powder burns and his voice hoarse from shouting orders through the night-long battle, had finally accepted the inevitable and authorized the surrender of his remaining forces. The scene that greeted British troops as they moved cautiously through the snow-clogged streets was one of almost complete devastation. American soldiers, many wounded and all exhausted by their ordeal, huddled in doorways and behind makeshift barricades, their muskets stacked in neat piles, as required by the Articles of Surrender. The storm had continued throughout the night, covering the battlefield in a pristine blanket of white that concealed the blood and debris of combat, creating an eerily peaceful tableau that belied the violence that had raged just hours before. Governor Guy Carleton's conduct in the aftermath of the battle demonstrated the chivalrous behavior expected of 18th century military commanders. Despite the fact that the Americans had launched an unprovoked attack on his fortress during one of the most severe winter storms in recent memory, Carleton ordered that the wounded be given the same medical attention as his own men and that all prisoners be treated according to the established customs of war. General Montgomery's body was prepared for burial with full military honors, a gesture that impressed even his former enemies with its dignity and propriety. The final tally of American casualties painted a grim picture of the night's work. In addition to Montgomery's death and Arnold's severe wounding, approximately 60 Americans had been killed in the fighting, with another 400 taken prisoner. Many of the captured men were militiamen whose enlistments had been scheduled to expire within days, men who had followed their officers into battle, knowing that they would soon be returning to their farms and families. Now they faced the prospect of indefinite imprisonment in British custody with little hope of exchange or parole. Captain Morgan himself, despite his reputation as one of the most formidable fighters in the Continental Army, had been forced to hand over his sword to a British lieutenant who could barely contain his amazement at capturing such a renowned adversary. The Virginians' surrender marked the end of organized American resistance in the lower town, though small groups of soldiers continued to hold isolated positions until they could be located and convinced to lay down their arms. The strategic implications of the Quebec defeat extended far beyond the immediate loss of men and equipment. The failure of the assault effectively ended American hopes of bringing the vast territory of Quebec into the rebellion eliminating any possibility of French-Canadian support and leaving the northern frontier exposed to British retaliation. More importantly, the defeat demonstrated that American forces, despite their successes in earlier engagements, were not yet capable of conducting complex operations against well-prepared defensive positions. Benedict Arnold, despite his painful wound, refused to abandon his position outside Quebec's walls, maintaining a siege that everyone knew had become largely meaningless. From his hospital bed, the colonel continued to issue orders and plan operations, driven by the same fierce determination that had brought him through the Maine wilderness. However, without sufficient troops or equipment to mount another serious assault, Arnold's siege became little more than a face-saving gesture designed to maintain American presence in the region until reinforcements could arrive. The political ramifications of the defeat were equally severe. The Continental Congress had invested enormous resources in the Quebec expedition, diverting men and supplies that were desperately needed elsewhere. The failure to capture the fortress meant that those resources had been wasted at a time when the Continental Army could ill afford such losses. Furthermore, the defeat provided British propagandists with powerful ammunition to use against the American cause, demonstrating that colonial forces were incapable of achieving their ambitious military objectives. As news of the disaster spread throughout the 13 colonies, it became clear that the Quebec expedition had been the first major defeat for American forces in the Revolutionary War. The failure would have lasting consequences for American strategy and morale, forcing military planners to reconsider their assumptions about what colonial forces could reasonably be expected to accomplish against professional European armies and fortifications. The spring thaw of 1776 revealed the full extent of the transformation that the failed Quebec assault had wrought upon the American cause. As the snow melted away from the lower town's cobblestones, it exposed not just the physical debris of battle, but the psychological scars that would influence American military thinking for years to come. The defeat had shattered the early confidence of the Continental Army and forced a fundamental reassessment of colonial military capabilities. Benedict Arnold maintained his futile siege throughout the winter and into the spring, his force gradually dwindling through disease, desertion, and the expiration of enlistments. The colonel's stubborn refusal to admit defeat became both an inspiration and a source of concern for American military leaders, who recognized his courage while questioning the wisdom of maintaining an obviously hopeless position. Arnold's correspondence during this period reveals a man grappling with the dual demons of physical pain and professional humiliation, emotions that would later contribute to his transformation from patriot hero to despised traitor. The arrival of British reinforcements in May 1776 finally forced the Americans to abandon their positions around Quebec and retreat up the St. Lawrence River. The fleet that appeared in Quebec's harbor carried not just fresh troops, but also a psychological message that the British Empire was prepared to commit whatever resources were necessary to maintain its hold on North America. For the Americans, the sight of those ships represented the final collapse of their northern strategy and the beginning of a more defensive phase of the war. The tactical lessons learned from the Quebec disaster would influence American military doctrine throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. The failure demonstrated that colonial forces, regardless of their courage and determination, were not yet capable of conducting complex coordinated attacks against well-prepared defensive positions. Future American strategies would emphasize the irregular warfare tactics that had proven successful at Lexington and Concord, rather than the conventional European-style assaults that had failed so catastrophically at Quebec. The human cost of the expedition extended far beyond those killed or captured in the assault itself. The grueling march through the Maine wilderness had broken the health of many participants, leaving them with chronic ailments that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma of the defeat affected not just the soldiers who participated, but their families and communities, who had invested so much hope in the Northern Campaign's success. Governor Guy Carleton's victory at Quebec established his reputation as one of Britain's most capable colonial administrators and military commanders. His humane treatment of prisoners and dignified conduct throughout the siege won him respect, even from his enemies, and demonstrated that the conflict need not descend into the barbarism that would later characterize other theaters of the war. Carleton's success also reinforced British confidence in their ability to maintain control over their remaining North American territories. The French-Canadian population's failure to rally to the American cause proved to be one of the most significant disappointments of the entire expedition. American leaders had genuinely believed that the inhabitants of Quebec, with their memories of French rule and their resentment of British governance, would welcome liberation by fellow rebels. The reality proved far more complex, as most French Canadians chose neutrality over the uncertain prospects offered by alliance with the American colonies. As the war progressed and American forces achieved victories in other theaters, the Quebec defeat would be remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overambition and inadequate preparation. The failure served as a reminder that revolutionary fervor, while a powerful motivating force, was no substitute for professional military expertise and careful logistical planning. The lessons learned in the frozen streets of Quebec would inform American military thinking throughout the long struggle for independence and beyond. The storm that had seemed such a promising ally on that New Year's Eve in 1775 ultimately proved to be an impartial force of nature that favored the defenders over the attackers. The blizzard's legacy would live on in military circles as an example of how weather could determine the outcome of battles as decisively as courage, strategy, or firepower. The Quebec assault had failed not just because of British defensive preparations or American tactical errors, but because the forces of nature had aligned themselves with those who held the stronger position. Behind stone walls and well-stocked magazines. In the end, the story of the Quebec assault stands as a testament to both the nobility and the futility of desperate courage in the face of overwhelming odds, a reminder that even the most heroic efforts cannot always overcome the combined forces of human preparation and natural adversity.